Hey guys, and welcome to today's live stream. We're going to be talking about a little bit about a balanced diet. Hopefully you guys are going to find this really interesting. It's a little bit of a minefield, so we'll go through that, hopefully give you guys some really good tips as well, and that will be really good, hopefully.
If you have any questions, let me know.
If you have any questions, we've got Lara on the other side of the camera. She's going to be taking down your questions, so please do post those. I know we can go down a few rabbit holes with this topic today, so if you do have questions, post those in the comments and we'll do our best to answer those. And with that being said, let's get into today's live stream. Awesome. So welcome to the live stream. And just before we get into today's topic, remember there is that that competition out at the moment. It ends tomorrow for the inversion table. So if you haven't already entered that, it's free to enter the competition. There'll be a link in the description whether you're watching on Facebook or YouTube. So do please enter if you're interested. With that being said as well, if you are new to the channel, please do consider subscribing. Now, let's get into the topic. We've got a few things on the board here that we're going to be discussing today, and really this area is a minefield, and I just wanted to start out with covering this because it is something that's important, and we all need to acknowledge that when we're talking about diet, because there are people that are very strongly on the fence for one of these diets or others that have been mentioned, and that can sometimes be a result of information that's been propagated over the last 50 to 100 years. If we look back over the years at different sort of fads and things that have come out based on research that maybe isn't necessarily done with the best intentions, we can see that we go through phases of certain foods being terrible, then they're good, then they're not good, and depending on which era you've grown up in, you'll have certain viewpoints around certain foods, and sometimes getting new information can kind of really be quite difficult to incorporate into the way in which we view diet or our view of the world. So it is important to have an open mind and review the research and not necessarily be bogged down on one thing. And a classic example of that is the changeover from fat or the relationship between fat and sugar and which one's good and bad for you, and the incorporation of things like margarines, etc. So it's worth just bearing that in mind as an example. And if we get any questions on this sort of stuff in the live stream today, then we might go on and maybe go down the rabbit hole on one of these particular topics for you guys, to give you guys a bit more information with various research papers to hand to just sort of back up some of that those points and give you guys a bit more of an evidence-based approach there. So with that being said, we've got some various diets on the back here that I just wanted to draw out, and we've just picked these generally, and they kind of cover the spectrum, if you will. We've got the two ends of the spectrum and then the stuff in the middle, and we'll go through those here. So we've got the vegan and plant-based one I've got at the top, and this isn't in any preferential order or anything like that. It's just the first one I wrote down. So we've got the vegan plant-based one, then we've got the things like the paleo, the Atkins and the keto diet, and then we've got at the very bottom the carnivore diet, which is one that hasn't necessarily got as people aren't as aware of. But essentially these are the different types of diets, and we're looking at where we're getting our food from, what source are we getting off, are we using as our food, and then going on from there. And I wanted to draw out two differences. It's the top one here and the bottom one here. These two talk a lot about what food type we're having. Is it an animal or is it a plant? Seed, nuts, etc. And that's those two, which you can get people that are a little bit more not obsessive, but very, very strict about those diets, and maybe we'll get into them, but not necessarily do them as well as we otherwise could do. And there's various pitfalls here. For example, you could say, well, I like steak, I'm going to do the carnivore diet. Well, the carnivore diet isn't just having steak. We have to have things like liver, we have to have bone broths and other sorts of foods as well, which are the whole part essentially of the animal in order to get our nutrition. And if we aren't aware of that, it requires a bit of effort, and also in sourcing some of these things, then we are going to end up being deficient in certain things. And the same is true of the vegan-based diet. If we're not careful with taking it in a diligent approach, the way in which it's designed, and we just take it, it's sort of, it's plant-based, so I'll just have plant-based foods. If we're not necessarily going all the way and getting the balanced diet within that diet itself, then we're going to struggle as well. We're not going to get what we need. And then we've got the ones in the middle. These focus a little bit more on the actual food type we're having. So fats, carbs, proteins, etc. We're looking at seeds, nuts and meats and those sorts of things with veg, etc. So it's maybe a little bit more likely you're not going to get into too much trouble with these sorts of diets because they're going to give you a little bit more choice in certain respects. So that's something to bear in mind when we are choosing any of these diets. We must use them as a tool to have a balanced diet, not just to go down one route. We have to still put a little bit of effort into figuring out which foods within this diet are appropriate and which are giving me my necessary vitamins and minerals, which are giving me my protein. Am I getting them in the right sources? For example, a big issue with some of the ones up here are going to be, are we getting enough protein on board? And that may be something that we don't necessarily look at and we don't quantify. And then if we're not, we need to adjust the way in which we're doing it. Maybe we're having some more of certain foods, we're having a few more nuts and seeds. Well, that's going to affect the fat balance. Are we having too much fats? Are we not having enough fats, etc.? We need to consider all these things. Now, I wanted to break down fats, carbs, and proteins because they are relatively the building blocks, if we will, of everything else. We've got vitamins and minerals, etc. as well, but these are really the ones I wanted to just spend a bit of time covering. Fats themselves, they've been demonized for a very long period of time, but the fats are used as energy. They are the most efficient form of energy. Every 1 gram of fat is going to produce 8 calories. That's for us to burn. We burn it in a very efficient way. We can burn it, when we're sat down doing things. Carbs are as efficient as protein, essentially, although maybe that would be our first port of call in a lot of cases, and those are just energy. And then we've got protein, which can be used as energy. But the fats and the proteins also have other uses. They have fats are essential for absorbing and processing many hormones. So if we don't have fat, then we are going to get into a lot of trouble. And you see this in the extreme of bodybuilders, which are maybe cutting down towards the date of a show, where their fat levels get very, very low, and that negatively impacts our hormone metabolism, and it negatively impacts the way in which we produce and absorb hormones. So that's something to bear in mind. Although fat is demonized, I'm going to have a no-fat diet, a low-fat yogurt, a low-fat this, a low-fat that. If you don't have the right good fats, then we are going to get into trouble with regards to absorbing the appropriate levels of nutrients. So that's something very, very important. And just on topic, vitamin D, for example, you need to have it with fats. You need to absorb it with fats. So it's worthwhile bearing that in mind, especially how important things like vitamin D are with current circumstances in the immune system. So that's worth bearing in mind. One thing I do notice quite a lot is with carbohydrate, people tend to have a lot of this. We're sat down all day, not necessarily doing as much as we should do, yet 50% of our plate is carbohydrate, which only serves to produce energy. And if it's not energy, it's going to be stored. So is that necessarily the best approach? We do want to think about these things, and it's worth considering how much of your plate is actually carbohydrate. And are you that active? Are you doing that much exercise on a daily basis to warrant needing that much energy? These sorts of things are worth considering. And then we've got protein. Protein is the one that we talk a lot about in the Back in Shape group. I know a lot of you guys in that group have talked about that and maybe done the evaluation to say, hey, am I getting enough protein on a daily basis? It's so important for hormones, rebuilding skin, hair, nails. Protein's broken down to form collagen. We know how important that is from previous live streams. And also in more emergency scenarios, we will break down protein to produce energy. So that's something to bear in mind. I know I touched on energy a moment ago, but we tend to not disrupt protein because essentially it's almost like breaking down the house to produce energy, breaking down our body to produce energy, and we don't really want to do that. So if we've got a good amount of fats or carbs, then we're going to use those first. We will not tend to rely on protein because it is so important, and bear that in mind. Are we getting enough protein on a daily basis? It's something really to consider. Now, moving on from there, I wanted to touch on one of the problems that we get nowadays is the way in which that food is grown. So a lot of the food through mass production, etc., food prices are going up. People are trying to produce more food at scale for less cost to offset that. We are getting a decrease in nutritional value of these foods, and this is why you do get people with deficiencies and things like B12, etc., vitamin D, etc. All these different foods, we're not necessarily getting the same quality of foods, even though we may be going down a vegan route, etc., or having a good amount of vegetables, etc., in our food, even our chickens, etc. They're not grown in the way in which they used to be grown, and therefore the quality is maybe not there. If you then compare that, for example, my grandfather's 95, 96 this year, he's got an allotment, been working on it for decades, and that the food that comes from there is grown in a different way. The soil's been tended properly, everything goes back into the soil. We're not pillaging the soil for all it's worth and leaving a barren wasteland to then sow new seeds into. We are dealing with the soil properly, and that is really, really important, and we don't necessarily get that from the foods that we're buying from the supermarket. So having things like allotments, and I know a lot of the guys in the back shape, some of you guys have your own allotments and do the gardening, etc. as well, so those sorts of foods are going to be more nutritious, generally speaking, especially if we're growing them in a good, sustainable way, which is putting nutrients back into the soil as well. So that's worth bearing in mind. And then it gets me to sort of the end part of today's topic, talking about, so what do you do going forwards? How do we improve our diet? Well, we want to actually first observe our diet. What are we actually eating on a daily basis? And if we're going to go down one of these routes, if you're going to go down the vegan route, if you're going to go down the paleo route, if you're going to go down the keto route, if you're going to do this with any seriousness and actually really look to say, look, I want to take control and have a balanced diet, have a good diet, use measurements to help these sorts of things. So get a blood test done. Actually do just a general blood test. That you can do them all over the place now. We've mentioned in the past using online companies to get the blood drawn, and you get sort of a little test and readout of all your figures to actually say, look, what's my cholesterol, what's my sugars, what's my insulin levels, all these other different measures, and then go down one of these diets properly for an extended period of time and retest with your bloods, because some people will do fantastic on a vegan diet, others will look woefully unwell. And the same thing for other ones. Carnivore diet, some people will absolutely thrive on it, others will really not like it. And there is a lot of evidence to suggest that this partially is to do with which part of the world you're from as well, how those cultures have grown up with certain food types more than others. For example, a big one for the vegan side of things is lentils. They are a good source of protein, but certain people that haven't grown up from certain communities with lentils, who try and throw them into their diet, suffer tremendously when they incorporate them as part of their diet, and it's just not viable. And there's no point forcing something that actually isn't in your best interest from a health point of view. So we need to know that actually an awful lot of the research is suggesting that different diets work well for different people. And the only way you're going to know if your diet's well is if you do it consistently for a period of time with some objective tests. And those blood markers are very good ways of actually saying, is this actually good? Are my thyroid levels getting better? Are my fat levels changing? Are my cholesterol levels changing? You know, all of these different things can really allow us to effectively look at our diet, rather than saying, oh, I'll give that a go for 2-3 weeks and see how it goes. So please don't try and do that. And then finally, if we are concerned that we're not necessarily getting enough in the way of nutrients and vitamins, minerals, or protein, as we mentioned before, measure it. How much are you actually getting? Just take a typical day or a typical few days and say, am I getting enough of my nutrients on a daily basis? And often we will get patients in the clinic, and in the past they've asked their GP and they say, oh, I went to my GP and said, should I take a vitamin supplement, or should I take this supplement or that, or should I take protein? And they say, oh, just get it from your diet. Well, that's fine advice, but we're busier than ever nowadays. Maybe not so much with current circumstances, but maybe. It's not always practical to get all of your nutrients from a diet, and sometimes it's just not possible for various reasons. Using supplements can supplement a healthy diet, not replace a healthy diet. And sometimes it can just be a help to, for example, with the protein intake. It's so important for so many different parts of our body, especially if we're trying to heal. Having a little protein shake that's good quality being the most important, can really, really help keep us on track to make sure we're providing our body with all we need to keep it fueled, keep it functioning, and keep it as well as possible. So that's pretty much it from me. We're going to Q&A.
Okay, awesome. Good morning, everybody. Yes, please do keep your questions coming in. On Facebook, Mandy has asked, I know you touched on the protein. Could you remind me of how much I need a day?
Yeah. So I'm going to use this example because it's easy, not because this is actually your weight, Mandy. So if we weighed 100 kilos, which I'm pretty sure Mandy doesn't weigh 100 kilos. If we weighed 100 kilos, we want to be getting 1 gram per kilogram of body weight minimum, and really 1 to 1.4. 1.4 is where we should be shooting. So you should be getting about 100 grams to 140 grams a day if you're a 100 kilo individual. There is research which we have touched on in the past, that as we get a little bit older, our sensitivity to levels of protein decreases. So there's the subsequent statement to that is that actually as we get a little bit older, we need a little bit more because we're not as sensitive to it, and that's sensitive to the amino acids, etc., that trigger our body to do something with that protein. So it's worth bearing that in mind as well. But really shooting really closer to that 1.4 think about it. We're looking to build. If we're looking to build up, recover, maybe you're in phase 3. You know, obviously, Mandy, you're doing great with the phase 3 work. We're looking to build muscles. We're looking to improve strength and stability to maybe protect our spine. We need to be providing ourselves with the appropriate building blocks. It's no use if we're trying to build that house delivering 1 brick a day. We want to deliver 100 to 140 bricks a day, and that way we're going to be able to build the house faster. We're also going to be able to repair any damage that we're doing, because as we are going through rehab and strengthening things up, we are creating a small degree of tissue damage that needs to be repaired. Well, we can't get that from carbs. If you're just having a load of pasta, a load of potatoes, a load of rice, you're not building anything with that stuff. And even if you're having a load of vegetables, if you're having a load of, you know, vitamin C, this, that, the other, none of that's protein. It's not building anything. It's something to bear in mind if we're trying to build. Now, maintenance is a little bit different. We still do need to replace these things because we're producing hormones, etc., every single day. But it is worth bearing that in mind, especially if you're looking to recover.
Awesome. Mandy, I will pop the link for the blood tests in the comments as soon as we are finished with the live stream. Sally has said here, my diet has changed since being in the back in shape and upping my protein intake. It was lower than I thought, and it wasn't hard to incorporate with a bit of thought and planning.
Yeah, it's super easy. I think a lot of people really, and to be honest, a lot of the research that we've done, it does tend to be females a little bit more than men that tend to really suffer, especially as we get older, tend to really suffer with not getting enough protein. And some of the research points you're looking at, where they're looking at the average population and the amount that they're getting, it's just awful. I don't know how on earth we ever manage to sustain ourselves if we're having such low levels of something that is essential to the human body. People just don't realize. They think protein, they think, oh, a big steak, oh, that, you know, we don't need that. But it's your skin, which you know, cosmetically, skin, hair, cosmetic again, nails, cosmetic again. All of these things are produced, collagen with our joints and our skin, you know, the keratin that's in our hair and nails. All of these things are derived from protein. The hormones,
you know,
it's fantastic.
I just had a thought. It might also be because I've had a conversation with my parents, they're wary of having a lot of red meat because they say that it takes longer to digest, so they don't want it to kind of, you know, give them anything that might lead to something like constipation or something along those lines. So that is a really interesting one, because I was actually looking at a research paper. This is a very long time ago, which was actually looking at that as a hypothesis, and they were actually testing abdominal discomfort and constipation in meat only, normal diet, and then high fiber diet. And the only group that had very low levels of constipation and perfectly normal bowel movements was the meat group. That being said, if you are someone that doesn't eat a lot of meat, and this is where the test is always so wrong, you don't eat meat all week and then you decide to have a ribeye steak on Friday, and then your body, or you haven't had it in months, and then you go out for a meal and you go, oh, I'm going to have the steak today, and then the next day you go, oh, that didn't agree with me. Well, you haven't had steak in 3 or 4 months, or you only have a very small amount, and then we go and have loads, and our body reacts to that because we don't have the necessary enzymes. You could also say that maybe your body's spending a long time digesting that food because there's lots of nutrients in there that it needs to break down, lots of different nutrients. So it's worth bearing that in mind. We've got fats, we've got proteins, we've got vitamins and minerals, all those other sorts of things in there that are needing to be broken down. And also, that kind of statement fundamentally doesn't actually agree with the reality that animals that eat only plants have longer digestive tracts, because it takes longer to digest plants than it does to digest meat. So that it's again, that's another example of kind of previous thinking that actually, when you go and say something like that, well, what if meat supposedly is taking longer to digest? Why is it that all animals that eat meat have shorter digestive tracts than animals that eat only plants? You know, that those two statements can't necessarily coexist. Yes, interesting.
It's worth bearing that in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, wonderful. Let me just have a look here. Oh yes, in terms of the amount of protein intake people should be having. Would you mind just reminding everyone that when they buy a pack of chicken, it's not the weight of the chicken?
Yes, very important. So you might have 100 grams of chicken. You are not doing 100 grams of chicken, because in that chicken it's got some fat, it's got a lot of water, etc. That might be 25 to 27 grams of protein in that chicken breast. That's the figure that we're looking at. We're not looking at the 100 grams. That's really quite an important one to draw out. Because if we're only having 100 grams of chicken breast and we're saying, oh, I've more than exceeded it, that's not strictly true. So do look at the actual protein content rather than just the actual raw item itself. And that's where, as well, one thing we haven't discussed too much is the calorie side of things. Calories, essentially the calories in, calories out. That's the amount of energy we are consuming versus the amount of energy that we are burning. We have to also bear in mind we don't want to have too restrictive a diet. There are benefits to having restrictive diets or very, very low calorie diets for periods of time for a number of different reasons, longevity being one of them, and the sort of fasting, intermittent fasting side of things. But sustained low calorie is just basically running yourself into deficiency. So we want to be mindful of that. And one of the areas where we can sometimes get caught out there with very low calories is when we're not having any animal products as well. So in some diets which are a little bit more only plants, unless we're diligent in having the appropriate levels of seeds, nuts, and foods which have high fat in the plant world, we can get caught out on incredibly low calories, which leads you to low lethargic energy levels and other problems as well.
Okay, Kate asked a question here. She said, what are your views on foods such as kefir, sauerkraut, etc. as gut-friendly supplements, as well as the extra protein when absorption is a problem? She said, I do have them all, but do they actually do what they claim? I'm not
100% sure. Truth be told,
sauerkraut is the raw cabbage that you ferment. So it's like pickled cabbage, but I'm not sure about its gut friendliness.
We have lots of different bacteria that do different things. One of the things I do know, and this may go some way to answering the question, is that if you, for example, switched from a normal diet, so maybe you were doing paleo or just a normal balanced diet, so to speak, a little bit of fats, a little bit of carbs, a little bit of protein from food, from animal and plant-based sources, and in balance. If you're having that and you switched rapidly to a meat-only diet, and this is just a very extreme one, you will have digestive issues, generally speaking, for around about 2-3 weeks or so, while your body is changing over. And this is something where your body will start to then produce, or you will have more of those bacteria in your gut that essentially are digesting that particular type of food. So if we're taking a cabbage, you're trying to get hold of bacteria that are there to digest and metabolize cabbage, so plant-based food. So maybe those are would be more favorable if you're going down a plant-based diet. Whereas if we had something else, like maybe used certain yogurts, which are coming more from an animal-based food, maybe those would be more akin to digesting meats, etc. So it's worth bearing that in mind. Different enzymes, different bacteria in our gut will be digesting different materials, different food types. So if that probiotic, if you will, is derived from plants, then maybe that's going to help you with plants. And if it's derived from more of an animal product, maybe that's going to help you more with your animal food products. I don't 100% know. I'm literally hypothesizing right in front of you here, but it's something worth following, a sort of a logical line of thought to then see, okay, well, maybe we can look into that a little bit more in the future.
Yeah, Sally's just also given some advice here to Kate just about a particular diet that she's following. I believe it's for irritable bowel syndrome, which is a tool that she can use as well.
Awesome.
She says nuts and seeds and pea protein and plain chocolate have helped.
Good.
So,
yeah,
fantastic.
The thing is,
everyone is so different, aren't they?
Yeah, and that's the one thing. Your diet can really it can make or break you, so to speak, and people can move on to some of these diets and actually they're fantastic, and it does make you so euphoric about that particular diet, but other people may not necessarily work for that diet. It's always worth trying these things. If you're struggling, if you're not doing well, then get the blood test the new diet. See, you know what, my health is just not there, my digestive system's always been a problem. Take the time, go get the blood test, and then say, right, for the next 5-6 months, I am going to do this particular dietary regime. It makes sense to me. It's ticking all the boxes with regards to nutrients, and I'm comfortable with doing it in my life. If it's too restrictive, don't even bother, because it's not sustainable for the long term. That's the nice thing about, for example, personally doing things like keto. It is quite sustainable for the long term. You can do it quite easily or quite comfortably, especially if it's generally keto, maybe not all the way, but using principles from that can really lead to a sustainable lifestyle choices, which means you can still enjoy yourself when you're going out at restaurants. But make a choice with one of these diets and then follow it. But also recognize that other people may not necessarily respond to that diet as well as you, and that's not your fault and that's not their fault. It's just that we are all different.
Okay. Brilliant, awesome. I think that is everything for today. Please don't forget to enter the competition if
Yes,
you haven't done so already.
So tomorrow we will be announcing the winner of the Tita inversion table. It's a pretty awesome device. We did a whole video on how to use it, inversion tables in general, and we will be announcing one winner tomorrow on the live stream. At the end of the live stream, to say who has won the Tita table. We will then be needing you, whoever you are, to contact us and give us your details so we can send it over to you. It is a big box, so do bear that in mind. Please don't be out when it gets delivered, otherwise you'll have to go and collect it, which won't be good for your back. That will not be good for your back. Okay, so it is a big box, so do please enter that. One lucky winner will win that tomorrow. Thanks so much for joining us anyway on today's live stream. Thanks for those questions. Hopefully it gave you guys a bit of a sort of an insight into some things to think about. We didn't necessarily go super deep into any one topic, but things to think about, because principles generally can be applied to many different things rather than going down specific examples, because sometimes those are just too narrow to appeal to many different people, and they don't educate you around that as much as actually getting some principles that we can adhere to for the long term. So hopefully you found it helpful. If you are new to the channel, please do consider subscribing. We do these live streams every single weekday, and we will be back tomorrow with another one. Thanks so much for joining us on today's video. Hopefully you found it packed full of useful information. If you want to learn more about the premium Back in Shape membership, there's going to be a video somewhere underneath here. And if you want to stay up to date or tune in to some of our more recent live streams and the Q&As at the end of those, then that's going to be down here. And remember, you can subscribe to the channel up here and hit the notification bell to make sure you know when we next go live, so you can join us for our next live stream and Q&A.